world is intrigued by fossils. I've always enjoyed the fossil digs, carrying the young people with me and watching their eyes light up as they find something really significant. Watch them imagine these creatures as they lived not in the not too distant past, I believe. The fossil record, many have been convinced, says evolution, and many Christians are intimidated by that. I think the actual record says exactly the opposite. I think when you look at billions and billions of dead things in rocks laid down by water all over the world, you're seeing a record of judgment rather than a record of evolution. This is the alternative view. But we want to look at the evidence from the fossil record today. If there is evidence of evolution, then this would be where you would find it, in the fossil record. And we're told over and over again that the fossil record actually proves evolution. It is the critical evidence. S.M. Stanley from Johns Hopkins University says it's doubtful whether in the absence of fossils, the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis. He says the fossil record, and only the fossil record, provides direct evidence of major sequential changes in the Earth's biota. This is where it's at, if you please. If there is proof, it would have to be here. And I hope you remember that statement. We'll refer to it later when we begin to see that that evidence does not favor evolution and that they are without the fossil evidence as far as support for evolution. Let's also remember a point that's made by John Horner. He's the paleontologist whose life was reflected in the Jurassic Park. He was the real life character, represented as digging up fossils in Montana. He says paleontology is a historical science, a science based on circumstantial evidence after the fact. We can never reach hard and fast conclusions. These days, it's easy to go through school for a good many years, sometimes through college, without ever hearing that some sciences are historical or are by nature inconclusive. Science involves what you can repeat. That is, when you reach scientific proof, conclusions in science, it's as a result of experimentation, observation, repeatability. You can't do that when you're evolving from an ape to a man, for example. That's not repeated in the laboratory. And so this is historical. The evidence, the only only conclusive evidence, is not going to provide conclusive proof. However, we do make predictions and we can learn a great deal, and it is a scientific investigation when we look at the evidence and compare the models. And one of the ways to compare models is to look at the predictions that are made by the two models. When we consider the fossil record, there are very obvious opposite predictions that are made by the two models. If you are an evolutionist, you would predict a simple beginning, a gradual progression upward, linked through things that are kin. This predicts the nature of the record in the beginning, and then the creation model would predict the opposite, the complex, abrupt beginning. They would be diverse from the start, and we should be able to look at the fossil record and tell the difference. It should be relatively simple. As we look at the continuing record, there would be predictions of similarities by the evolutionist, indicating kinship, but they would be branching similarities, as kinship would necessarily imply, and an allied continuum. While on the other hand, the creationist would expect that there would be similarities, but they would be similarities not branching, but of a mosaic pattern, where the artist would use a blue tile here and then a blue tile there where he needs it, similar but not connected, as a designer would do. Again, there would be similarities, but they would be separate and distinct, and stasis would be the order of the day rather than continuing change. Stasis, status quo, stays the same, fancy word used by evolutionists or by many scientists. Now, as we look at the two models, and as we see the different predictions, And I tell you what the fossil record is, you might say, well, you're prejudiced. I would tell you that it favors the predictions of the evolutionists. But we're going to allow the evolutionists to describe the evidence for us. The quotes that we'll be using will be from the antagonistic witness. And some people misunderstand this concept. They say, well, you're not being fair. You're using people that disagree with you. But that's the point. That provides even stronger, better evidence. For example, when you're in court and you have a friendly witness who testifies on your behalf, and he says the accused is honest and he has no reasonable motive to lie, that'll help. But if, on the other hand, you have an antagonistic witness who makes these points, then the evidence is much stronger when he says the accused is honest, there's no reasonable motive to lie. In other words, when you have friendly testimony, that helps. But if you have acknowledgments contrary to interest, you have much greater weight given to the testimony. And the evidence that we're going to be giving then would be those who are testifying contrary to their interest. They're quotes from antagonistic witnesses. We want you to understand they're from devout believers, but they're believers in evolution. They are men of great faith, but they're men of faith in evolution. We'll begin with Richard Dawkins, who would certainly qualify as an evolutionist, a creation hater, I think is a fair statement, and we'll see statements from him that justify that. He's from Cambridge. He wrote the book, The Blind Watchmaker. In it, he describes the beginning of the fossil record. He says, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted the creationist. Yes, well, I would plead guilty there. They begin, he has faith that it's an evolutionary appearance, but it's not because of an evolutionary record. That's not there. It appears without that record, without any evolutionary history. And that's, of course, exactly what we would predict. Notice the depiction by National Geographic in this page, Explosion of Life, describing the lowest, the beginning layer of the fossil record, that is where the fossils began in abundance, in the Cambrian, the bottom of the geologic column. This is an explosion of life, and that's a term that's typical in describing that. We'll see more about why that's justified in a moment. One of the more typical fossils found there would be the trilobite. Probably more trilobites than anything else there in the Cambrian. Way back in 1974, here we see a description of trilobite eyes. You typically don't see this in the textbooks, but here in Science News, they may have been superior to current living animals, that is, in their eyes. They had, in principle, perfect vision. They possessed the most sophisticated eyes ever produced by nature. They looked like they were designed by a physicist. Now, again, I didn't write this, but if I had written it, I couldn't have done better. This is the most typical fossil in the lowest part of the geologic column, the beginning of the fossil record, and we see as sophisticated a part of our anatomy as you can find, and it's superior. Notice the description by Stephen Gould of Harvard, one of the more famous evolutionists of our time, recently deceased. He says the Cambrian explosion occurred at a geological moment, and we have reasons to think that all major anatomical designs may have made their evolutionary appearance at that time. Now, it was an evolutionary appearance, but all of the anatomy, designs of anatomy, he would use that term, appeared right from the beginning. That's at the start. Not only the phylum Chordata itself, but all of its major divisions. Chordata, that's the division that we're in, the animals with backbones, and all of the major divisions. And where is that? That's at the beginning. Now, I couldn't have written the story better myself. Continuing, he says, since the so-called Cambrian explosion, no new phyla of animals have entered the fossil record. So you have them all right at the beginning and no new ones since. Now, what does that sound like, honestly? As you look at the different predictions made by the creationist and the evolutionist, which one is served best by the evidence? Here's a summary of statements that the evolutionists make regarding the beginning of the fossil record. It's complex, it's sudden right at the start, advanced as if they were planted there, according to Dawkins. Land plants, we have 60 genera of land plants. Many books will say that in the Cambrian there's nothing but shallow seas everywhere. We have fossils of land plants. That's obviously not accurate. Vascular plants, 6 different groups of the woody type plants. And then all the major anatomical designs, the chordata, all of its major divisions. We have vertebrates from a number of states across the country, and the article documenting that was published in '78. This is not new news. Vertebrates, animals with backbones from all of these places across the country. Since the Cambrian explosion, no new phyla. I'm sorry, I think it's obvious which model is served best, and this is not my description. This is the description of the evolutionist, the antagonistic witness about the most critical part of the fossil record, the beginning of that record. And furthermore, not only do we find complex animals right from the start, animals that would live at the bottom of the ocean, I think it's the beginning of a flood deposit, but we find that those animals are distinct and separate right from the start. Quoting here from Discover magazine, demonstrates that the large animal phyla of today were already present in the early Cambrian and that they were distinct from each other as they are today. Menagerie of clam cousins, sponges, segmented worms, other invertebrates that would be vaguely familiar to any scuba diver. If you go down to the bottom of the ocean, that's what you find in the Cambrian. But it's there today, and they're distinct and separate then as today. But in the textbooks, you see a very different representation. It's always illustrated with the simple things at the bottom. The complex things are not till you get to the top, and they're all graduated and connected in this branching pattern. That's not what the fossils say. And if you're interested in the implications of the fossil record, you can just X this out. This is not the record of the fossils. Stephen Gould says this very plainly. He says the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches, not the evidence of the fossils. The rest is inference, he says, however reasonable. But it is not from the fossils that you find these textbook-type trees that show the graduated progression. In fact, if you turn the tree upside down, you have a closer representation. He says it starts broad and goes downhill. This sweep of anatomical diversity is reached a maximum right after the initial diversification of multicellular animals. A fancy way of saying we had more diverse anatomy from the start. He goes on to say the later history proceeded by elimination, not expansion. It's a downhill process from a more complex and broad and diverse beginning. If you look at what Gould calls the cone of diversity, you see what's predicted in the fossil record, gradually starting from a simple beginning and getting more diverse and complex as you proceed through time. The actual truth, and these are diagrams that you'll find in Gould's book, is like this. We had more in the past, it's gone downhill to the point where we are now. But compare that again with what we see in the textbook, this gradual upward progression, which is the very thing that he says is not in the fossil record. Well, if this is not in the fossil record, where did it come from? What's the source of this kind of a representation? Again, let's allow the evolutionist to describe that for us. Here in Dotton Batten's book, Evolution of the Earth, that I was taught from at 2 different major state universities, we have arranged the groups in a traditional way with the simplest forms first. How did they get that way? Well, we arranged them that way with the progressively more complex groups following. The particular arrangement is arbitrary and depends on what definition of complexity you wish to choose. Now, this may be somewhat oversimplifying, and we don't want to misrepresent. This is their statement. But they go on the same page to describe really the basis for this. It's not the fossil record. It's arbitrary. It's something that they arranged, but the arrangement does have logic to it. He says things are alike because they are related. The less they look alike, the further removed they are from the common ancestor. And so this similarity allows them to arrange this into the family tree. Well, it's not that simple, because it's certain similarities excluding other similarities. And then, well, there's a lot of ignoring of evidence that goes on in that process. But this is the way it's represented. And I've been in class where I've been scolded. Don't you know that kin, cousins, brothers and sisters look alike? And, well, yes, we understand that. We see that as a possible explanation. And when we look at apes and men, for example, can there be any denial that there is a very dramatic similarity here? This is obvious. We can see dissimilarities, but honestly, the similarities are much more dramatic. The question is why? Well, the evolutionist seldom asks that question. He just knows that it's because of common ancestors. But that's not necessarily the only explanation. In fact, I believe there's a better explanation when we look at all the similarities. You drive down the street and you see houses that appear similar because they're cousins. Right, well, no, that's not the case. They had a common designer. That's a much better explanation. And when we look at the record of anatomy, when we look at animals in the animal kingdom, we see similarities. We're often referred to the pendactyl form of the vertebrate hand. And yes, that's obvious. We see, but again, why? You can explain it in terms of common ancestry or in terms of common designer. Actually, common designer doesn't work, that is, works much better here. Common genetics doesn't work because if they were from common genetics, they would come from the same parts of the embryo. The embryo would develop this way as the beginnings of the hand would develop, and it would be the same in the rabbit as in the pigeon and in the frog, and we see the results being similar. But if it's from common genetics, it ought to be from common beginnings in the embryo, and that's not the case. In the newt, it's from segments 2 through 5. In the man, it's from segments 13 through 18. That is, that segment in the embryo produces the hand. It's a different segment in the embryo that produces the hand in the newt, and from the lizard it's 6 through 9. It doesn't appear to be from common genetics. Common designer seems to work better, and there are other reasons for that as well. The argument from similarity we want to spend some time in. We're talking about the fossil record, but the only way that fossils mean anything in terms of creation or evolution is if you infer something, and for the evolutionist, it's being inferred from similarity. And this principle of similarity is what is the ball game. That's what makes them say something besides dead things in rocks. Similarities, though, lead us astray in many instances. There were arguments made in the past, for example, from chromosomes. We look at the order that's indicated here. Humans have 46, Penicillium 2, the opossum 22. Okay, it looks like an evolutionary progression here. See, the similarity in the order shows a progression upward toward man, until we look at the rest of the story. And now then, this argument is, while it's still in a few textbooks, it's generally been dropped because we find, yes, human has 46, but the chimp has more, 46. The fern has 480. The turkey has 82. Well, that doesn't look quite like the evolutionist would predict, and so typically that's, when you look at the whole picture, it begins to look a little different. Sometimes we're told we need to look at the amount of DNA, and that would show an evolutionary progression. Compared with humans, we see the euglena has about the same amount of DNA as we do. The liverwort, a moss-like plant, has 18 times as much, and here's a salamander that has 26 times as much. Well, that didn't help a whole lot either in terms of supporting evolution. This argument from similarity has been used since the beginning, and back shortly after Darwin's time, Haeckel came up with this famous argument that's been in thousands of textbooks, and it touts the similarity of embryos in the beginning of their development. And we see up at the top of the chart that these embryos are drawn to look very, very similar, but they develop into very different organisms, the pig and the fish and the salamander and the man. And that's been shown in textbooks. And I've had people say, well, this development from embryo, they came from the same kind of embryo, shows an evolutionary progression. I don't think it's necessarily, it necessarily follows, even if this were true, but it isn't. You've been lied to, unfortunately. This is the statement that we see emphasized here in the Times in London. The headlines just a few years ago, embryonic liar. It shows the embryos up at the top as drawn by Haeckel, very similar, back in Darwin's time. And in fact, Darwin referred to this argument and said he thought it was one of the best that he knew of. But compared with what's at the bottom, we see the actual pictures of these embryos that are supposed to be represented in the drawings, and they don't look similar at all. And so the Times just says the fellow's lying about this. We look in New Scientist, who reported the same kind of things. Here is fraud rediscovered, and we see the drawings down below and the actual embryos up at the top. This is fraud, and that's the only way to describe it. Notice the quotation from New Scientist. Although Haeckel confessed and was convicted of fraud. Now, this is not my assessment. This is what we read in New Scientist. He was convicted of fraud at the University of Jena. The drawings persist. That's the real mystery, Richardson said, and he's complaining about this in New Scientist, and certainly they do persist. Here is one of the more common biology textbooks that's used in our schools today, and sure enough, right there in with their bare face hanging out is this same drawings that Haeckel used 100 years ago to deceive. These similarities don't exist. Of course, there are similarities. Those don't. We're often referred to the similarity between apes and men with the DNA, and we're told the genome of ape and man is 99% similar, and this is supposed to prove that we came from a common ancestor. Well, this has been grossly exaggerated and corrected, though not in headlines. Here back in 2004 in Nature, they said they found 83% differences in the 231 genes that they compared between ape and men when they're looking at the amino acid sequence of the proteins, and then said 20% showed significant structural changes. Well, that's obviously considerably more than 1%. And as they pointed out, we've seen a much higher percentage of change than people speculated. And so this has been misrepresented. But let's just assume that that were true, and we often hear it repeated. It isn't, as we've seen. But we're told specifically there's 1.6% difference in the genome of the ape and man. But think about that for a moment. There are 3 billion nucleotides in the genome. 3 billion bits of information. That's 48 million nucleotides when we're talking about 1.6%. Now, how much difference would 48 million nucleotides make? Well, think about that in terms of cystic fibrosis, a terrible disease that is relentlessly fatal. That involves not 1% or 1.6%, but 1/10000000th of 1% of the genome. That's 3 nucleotides, not 48 million. With sickle cell anemia, we're looking at 1/3 of a billionth of 1%. That's 1 nucleotide. And yet we're told that it's only 1.6%. Of course, that's 48 million nucleotides when 1 produces a fatal disease, sickle cell anemia, and 3 produces cystic fibrosis. You're going to change 48 million, and it doesn't matter. It's not much difference. You randomly change 48 million nucleotides, and you have obvious disaster. There are dramatic similarities, and when we look, for example, at sheep, here is from a news report back in 2000, Sue Galloway, University of Otago and University of Finland, sheep are 98% the same. Our genes are the same, we're told. And then mice, here's reported in the National Human Genome Research Project. Overall, mice and humans share virtually the same set of genes. This was in 2006. On the average, and speaking of an average here, coding regions, the genomes are 85% identical. Some are 99% identical with mice. Well, we're proving more than the evolutionist is intending to prove here when we're looking at similarities. I think common design does a better job. Thinking about the implications, the logic involved here, what does similarity prove? You look at these two fish, they appear similar. What does it prove? Well, actually, neither one of them are fish. This one is a reptile, and then this one is a mammal, the one at the bottom. Neither one of them are fish. Both of them are similar to fish. None of neither the reptile, the mammal, or the fish are kin, but they look very similar, proving, well, we just leave those out when it comes to lining up the tree. And then we look at the poor critter represented here, the platypus, who's kin to almost everybody according to this interpretation. We see that he's like a bird, he's like mammals, he's like a paddlefish, a mammal, and just all kinds of similarities. The duck and fur like a beaver, he's kin to everybody. The old adage, that which proves too much proves nothing, is I think very apropos at this point. When we find similarities that don't count, that you don't look at, that you ignore, then that's called parallelisms, and that's not giving a solution to the problem, that's just naming the problem, and that's typical. Notice the statement here by Dr. Young, professor at Oxford. He refers to the fact there are similar features and they appear in distinct lines, and it's so common, it's almost a rule. Any detailed study of any group, this is going to confuse when you try to line them up, because you've got to eliminate those that are kin, that is, those that aren't kin but are very similar. And you're unable to distinguish, he says, those that are parallel and those that are descended. Well, what it amounts to is, if it fits the scenario of evolution, then they'll use the similarities. If it doesn't fit, then it's parallel and you don't use it. And that's not science. When you look at all of the picture, we saw with the chromosomes a moment ago, when you just look at part of the picture, then you can tell just about any tale you want. But when you look at the whole picture, it's very different. We're often referred to the blood serum of the chimpanzee, and yes, it's very similar. And if the right anti-serum is used, yes, you can actually interchange and use this as a human being. But when you look at milk chemistry, we see a significant difference with the chimpanzee. Our closest kin there turns out to be the donkey, which again doesn't fit the scenario the evolutionist would predict. In terms of cholesterol that we're all interested in, well, the garter snake has cholesterol just like we do. In terms of foot structure, we're interested in that in our efforts down at Glen Rose. As we look at the fossil footprints, we're looking for animals that might have made this. Sometimes we're told maybe an ape made them. Well, an ape has a hand for a foot. He doesn't have a foot like ours, but the glacial bear has a foot almost identical. If you put it as a mirror image, the thumb's big toe is on the outside instead of the inside, and of course he has claws and he's a quadruped. But if you remove the claws and put it in a mirror and remove the flesh, wow, it's just virtually identical, unlike the ape. In terms of tear enzyme, lo and behold, the chicken has a very complex enzyme, lysosome, just like we do, designed, I think, to attack the bacteria. We need it in our eyes, the chicken needs it in the egg. And here's that mosaic pattern, where the designer uses the blue tile here where he wants it and the blue tile there where he wants it. Yes, similarities, but not in a branching pattern. When you look at all of the picture, you see that branching pattern does not describe the similarities that we're looking at. In terms of blood antigen A, lo and behold, the butterbean has blood antigen A like we do, and wow. Brain hormone, the cockroach has a brain hormone just like we do. Here's a statement from Discover magazine saying, "Don't squash that roach, he may be your cousin." We're told the roach has a brain hormone just like ours, identical. It is the same. Now, they don't really put that in this tree and use that to line up the similarities. They leave out significant similarities to paint whatever picture they want. There was a cartoon back in Darwin's time that I think clearly illustrates this point. You begin with a pig and change that pig just gradually, and you can finally wind up looking like a bull. And that bull continues to change just a little bit, and it's obvious then that man evolved from the pig by way of the bull. And here's the proof. It's scientifically proved. See the diagram? It's the same kind of diagram that you see in the textbooks that's supposed to prove, supposed to be scientific evidence. You just line them up. See how they line up? What have you proved? Well, you're looking at similarities, ignoring other similarities, and lining them up according to the scenario. Now, this may make an interesting model that you can then test, but it's not proof. And don't look at it as proof when you see that in the textbooks. Summarizing then, in our first session on the fossils, this is the evidence. This, without it, it's just an outrageous hypothesis, as Stanley says. But when we look at the critical beginning of the fossil record, it's complex, it is abrupt, it is diverse. We have all of the major phyla right at the beginning. There have been none new since. The trees of life in the textbooks are from selected similarities. They're not from the fossils, they're not from embryology, they're not from genetics, and the similarities that are used to build the trees reveal a mosaic pattern, not a branching pattern. Now, when we look at that picture, the critical evidence is much more in favor of the creation model than the evolution model. It fits the facts best as described by the antagonistic witness. And so you can see why I like to talk about the fossils. I think they speak very clearly of a sudden complex beginning, not gradual progression over millions of years.